The CEO looked me straight in the eye and said I was too feminine to represent the company at the Pentagon meeting. Too feminine. Those words echoed in my head as security escorted me out of the building I'd called home for 8 years. But what Richard Morrison didn't know was that I'd already secured the exclusive 5 grams defense contract license in my personal name. And that contract? It was worth $920 million. Growing up gay in America teaches you to read between the lines. Every raised eyebrow when you speak. Every pause before someone shakes your hand. Every time you're passed over for the client-facing role because you don't fit their image of what a man should be. I learned to navigate corporate America by making myself smaller, quieter, more palatable. I perfected the art of being exceptional while remaining invisible. But excellence has a way of demanding attention, and attention, for people like me, can be dangerous. In boardrooms across this country, there's an unspoken rule. You can be gay, but don't be too gay. Don't gesture too much. Don't let your voice carry too much emotion. Don't remind them that you're different. I spent 15 years following those rules, climbing the ladder one strategic move at a time, always wondering when my authentic self would finally cost me everything. They thought firing me would silence my voice. Instead, they just handed me the microphone. If you've ever felt like you had to hide who you are to succeed, the story is for you. Subscribe to hear more stories of people who refuse to stay silent, and remember, your authenticity is your greatest weapon. My name is Daniel Martinez, and at 37, I was the youngest senior vice president in Morrison Tech's history. The company specialized in government telecommunications contracts, and I'd built my reputation on understanding both the technical complexities and the political nuances that made or broke deals worth hundreds of millions. My corner office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building had a view that reminded me daily of how far I'd climbed from my childhood in Queens. Every morning, I arrived at 7:30 sharp, always impeccably dressed in tailors that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd learned early that presentation mattered twice as much for people like me. My assistant, Jennifer, would already have my coffee waiting. Oat milk cortado, no sugar. She was one of the few people in the office who knew about my partner, Marcus, a pediatric surgeon who understood the demanding nature of my work. The subtle discrimination was constant, but rarely acknowledged. During client dinners, Richard Morrison, our CEO, would strategically seat me at the far end of the table if Pentagon officials were present. When I spoke during presentations, I watched colleagues exchange glances that they thought I couldn't see. My voice, which I'd never considered particularly feminine, apparently didn't match their expectations of what a defense contractor should sound like. Brian Walsh, the VP of Business Development, had a particular talent for undermining me in meetings. He'd interrupt my technical explanations with comments like, "Let me break this down in simpler terms," or, "What Daniel's trying to say is, it was never overtly hostile, just constant enough to chip away at my authority in front of clients." The microaggressions extended beyond the conference room. I was excluded from the golf outings where real business happened. When the company sponsored box seats at Yankees games for client entertainment, my name mysteriously never made the guest list. At the annual company retreat in the Hamptons, I noticed how conversations would shift when I approached groups of executives socializing by the pool. Sarah Chen, our chief technology officer, was one of the few allies I had in senior leadership. She'd worked her way up in a male-dominated industry and recognized the coded language of exclusion. During our weekly one-on-ones, she'd share insights about which clients were asking for different representation and which board members were questioning my cultural fit for certain contracts. I compensated for these slights by becoming indispensable. I studied every technical specification until I could recite them from memory. I learned the personal histories and political preferences of every Pentagon procurement officer. When competitors stumbled on proposals, I'd already anticipated their mistakes and positioned our solutions 3 steps ahead. The work consumed my life, but I told myself it was worth it. Marcus would find me still reviewing contracts at midnight, surrounded by technical manuals and regulatory documents. He'd bring me dinner and listen while I explained the intricacies of frequency allocations and cybersecurity protocols. He never complained about the weekends I spent preparing presentations or the vacations cut short by emergency client calls. My success was measured in numbers that spoke louder than whispered judgments. I'd secured over $2 billion in government contracts during my tenure. My team consistently exceeded revenue targets by 30%. Industry publications featured my insights on emerging telecommunications technologies. Yet I still felt like I was performing a role rather than living my truth. The weight of constant performance was exhausting. I'd catch myself modulating my voice during important calls, ensuring it stayed within some acceptable range of masculinity. I'd rehearse hand gestures in my office mirror, making sure they appeared authoritative rather than expressive. When clients visited our offices, I'd wear my wedding ring on my right hand instead of my left, a small deception that felt like survival. Despite the challenges, I genuinely loved the work. The intersection of technology and national security fascinated me. I believed that what we were building could protect American interests while advancing communications infrastructure. The contracts we secured weren't just business deals. They were contributions to technological superiority that would impact global security for decades. The opportunity that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The Department of Defense issued a request for proposals on a revolutionary 5 grams network infrastructure project. The contract was massive, $920 million over 7 years to build the most secure military communications network in American history. More importantly, the winning bidder would receive exclusive licensing rights to the underlying technology, effectively creating a monopoly on next-generation defense communications. Morrison Tech had been positioning for this moment for 3 years. I'd personally cultivated relationships with key decision-makers in the Pentagon's Communications Technology Division. My technical background in advanced encryption protocols made me the natural choice to lead the proposal team. Richard Morrison called me into his office the day after the RFP was released and confirmed what I'd been preparing for. This was my project to win or lose. The assignment came with unprecedented resources. I assembled a team of 15 engineers, 3 legal experts, and 2 former Pentagon officials who understood the bureaucratic maze we'd need to navigate. We established a secure floor in our building dedicated exclusively to the proposal, complete with classified document storage and CIF-level security protocols. The technical requirements were staggering. The network needed to support simultaneous encrypted communications for 50,000 users while maintaining quantum-resistant security protocols. Latency couldn't exceed 5 milliseconds across continental distances. The system had to be completely American-made, from semiconductors to software, to comply with national security regulations. I threw myself into the project with an intensity that worried even my workaholic standards. 16-hour days became routine. I studied frequency spectrum allocations until I could visualize electromagnetic compatibility in my sleep. I learned the manufacturing capabilities of every qualified supplier and memorized the security clearance levels of their key personnel. Marcus barely saw me during those months. I'd leave our apartment in Tribeca before he woke up and return after he'd gone to bed. Our conversations reduced to text messages and notes left on the refrigerator. He understood the importance of the project, but I could see the concern in his eyes when I'd emerge from my home office at 2 in the morning, still energized by technical breakthroughs. The proposal deadline was 6 months away, but I knew our competition was formidable. Lockheed Martin had unlimited resources and decades of Pentagon relationships. Raytheon's reputation in defense communications was legendary. Smaller firms like Palantir and Signal Sciences brought innovative approaches that could disrupt traditional thinking. As news of the contract spread through industry circles, I noticed subtle changes in how colleagues treated me. The project's visibility attracted attention from board members who'd previously ignored my existence. Suddenly, senior executives who'd never acknowledged my contributions were scheduling lunch meetings to discuss strategic alignment and brand representation. The shift became explicit during a board presentation in June. I'd spent weeks preparing a comprehensive overview of our technical approach and competitive positioning. The presentation went flawlessly. Even board members who typically check their phones during technical discussions were taking notes and asking detailed questions. After the meeting, board member Thomas Caldwell approached me in the hallway. He was old enough to remember when IBM required dress codes for their sales force and believed that government contracts should be handled by people who looked the part. His feedback was delivered with the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to influential conversations. He suggested that while my technical expertise was invaluable, the client-facing aspects of such a significant contract might benefit from different leadership. He emphasized the Pentagon's conservative culture and the importance of cultural alignment when representing American interests abroad. The subtext was clear: my sexuality, or at least my failure to hide it convincingly, was becoming a liability. Similar conversations began happening with increasing frequency. Richard Morrison mentioned during our weekly one-on-one that several board members had expressed concerns about perception management for such a high-profile contract. HR Director Amanda Foster scheduled a meeting to discuss professional development opportunities that focused heavily on executive presence and leadership gravitas. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same authenticity that made me effective at building relationships and understanding client needs was now being identified as a professional weakness. The emotional intelligence that helped me navigate complex negotiations was characterized as a potential liability in high-stakes government relations. I responded the only way I knew how, by working harder and becoming even more indispensable. I identified technical vulnerabilities in our competitors' approaches and developed countermeasures that would give us decisive advantages. I cultivated new Pentagon relationships and strengthened existing ones, often through late-night dinners and weekend coffee meetings that demonstrated commitment beyond normal business hours. Sarah Chen became my unofficial advisor during this period. She'd experienced similar challenges as an Asian woman in leadership and understood the impossible balance between authenticity and acceptability. Her advice was pragmatic: exceed every expectation while they searched for reasons to doubt me, and document every contribution in ways that couldn't be minimized or transferred to someone else. The breakthrough came in August when I discovered a critical flaw in the government's technical specifications. The encryption protocols they'd mandated were vulnerable to quantum computing attacks that would be feasible within the contract's 7-year timeline. I spent 3 weeks developing alternative approaches that would maintain security while actually reducing implementation costs. This wasn't just a technical improvement. It was a fundamental rethinking of the entire project architecture. My solution would save the Pentagon over $100 million while delivering superior security that would remain effective for decades. It was the kind of innovation that wins contracts and establishes industry leadership. I presented the discovery to Morrison and the executive team with the confidence of someone who just solved an impossible puzzle. The room was silent as I explained the vulnerability and demonstrated my solution. Richard Morrison asked detailed questions that confirmed he understood both the technical brilliance and commercial implications. The next 3 months were the most intense of my career. Armed with our breakthrough solution, I led a team that worked around the clock to perfect every aspect of our proposal. We conducted simulations that proved our approach could exceed performance requirements while delivering unprecedented cost savings. I personally verified that every component in our supply chain met security clearance requirements and that our manufacturing partners could scale production to meet government timelines. The Pentagon scheduled site visits for all qualified bidders in November. These presentations would be our final opportunity to demonstrate capabilities before contract awards were announced in December. I prepared for weeks, anticipating every possible question and rehearsing technical explanations that would resonate with both engineers and procurement officials. My presentation was scheduled for November 15th, exactly 3 weeks before the contract decision deadline. I'd invested 8 months of my life in this moment, and I'd never been more confident about any professional opportunity. The technical superiority of our solution was undeniable, our cost structure was competitive, and our implementation timeline was aggressive but achievable. The night before the presentation, Richard Morrison called me into his office for what I assumed would be final coordination and encouragement. Instead, he delivered news that felt like a physical blow. The board had made an executive decision to replace me as the project lead effective immediately. Brian Walsh would present our proposal to the Pentagon. Morrison's explanation was a masterclass in corporate euphemism. The board had concluded that such a significant contract required seasoned leadership with established Pentagon relationships. They appreciated my contributions to the technical development, but believed the client engagement phase needed different strengths. He assured me that my work would be fully recognized and that this decision reflected strategic considerations rather than any assessment of my capabilities. I sat in his office, listening to this careful language, understanding that 8 months of my life had just been erased by concerns about my suitability to represent American interests. The irony was devastating. I developed the solution that would win the contract, but I wasn't considered appropriate to present it. The following morning, I watched from my office as Brian Walsh and his team departed for the Pentagon presentation. Walsh had spent the previous evening reviewing my materials, asking questions about technical details he'd never bothered to understand during the development process. He carried my work in his briefcase while I remained in New York. Officially focusing on future opportunities, the presentation succeeded brilliantly. Pentagon officials were impressed by our technical innovation and cost advantages. Brian Walsh returned to the office that afternoon confident that Morrison Tech had secured the largest contract in company history. The celebration began immediately, with senior executives congratulating each other on their strategic vision and exceptional execution. I participated in the celebration with professional grace while feeling completely hollow inside. Colleagues who knew my contribution offered sympathetic smiles and private acknowledgments that justice hadn't been served. Sarah Chen stopped by my office later that evening to express her outrage, but we both understood that protesting would only damage what remained of my career prospects. The contract award was announced on December 3rd. Morrison Tech had won the $920 million contract, exactly as I'd predicted. The company's stock price increased by 30% in after-hours trading. Richard Morrison scheduled press interviews to discuss this transformational achievement. Brian Walsh was promoted to executive vice president and positioned as the visionary leader who'd secured America's communications future. I received a performance bonus that represented less than 1% of the contract value. My official role in the project was described as technical support in press releases that credited Walsh with the strategic breakthrough. Industry publications praised Morrison's leadership depth and Walsh's innovative thinking without mentioning my existence. The final insult came 3 weeks later during the company holiday party. Richard Morrison delivered a speech celebrating the Pentagon contract as validation of Morrison Tech's culture of excellence and commitment to American values. He specifically thanked Brian Walsh for embodying the leadership qualities that distinguished successful defense contractors. I stood in the back of the room, wearing my best suit and most professional smile, listening to Morrison celebrate my work while erasing my identity. The applause was thunderous. Walsh accepted congratulations with the confidence of someone who'd actually earned them. I excused myself early, citing a family obligation that no one questioned. That night, Marcus found me in my home office. staring at the contract documents that had consumed my life for 8 months. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside me and waited for me to process the betrayal. When I finally spoke, my voice was steadier than I expected. I told him about the backup plan I'd been developing since August, when the first suggestions about different leadership had surfaced. While Morrison Tech celebrated their victory, they'd overlooked a critical detail in the contract structure. The exclusive licensing rights for the underlying technology weren't automatically assigned to the winning bidder. They required separate documentation that could be filed independently. In September, anticipating exactly this scenario, I'd filed the licensing applications in my personal name. The technology patents, the encryption protocols, the network architecture that made our proposal superior, all of it was legally mine. Morrison Tech had won the right to build the Pentagon's network, but they couldn't implement it without licensing my innovations. Marcus asked why I hadn't mentioned this earlier. I explained that I'd hoped professional recognition would make the backup plan unnecessary. I'd wanted to win on merit rather than through legal maneuvering. But watching Richard Morrison celebrate my work while denying my existence had clarified my priorities. The next morning brought the final humiliation. Richard Morrison called me into his office at 8 a.m. sharp. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or corporate euphemisms. The company was restructuring my position due to cultural alignment concerns with major government clients. My employment was terminated effective immediately, with standard severance and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I sat there listening to the words that ended my 8-year career at Morrison Tech. Morrison emphasized that this decision was strategic and necessary for the company's future relationship with defense contractors. He assured me that my technical contributions were valued, but that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good of the organization. Security waited outside his office as I cleaned. Out my desk, watching as I packed 8 years of corporate memories into cardboard boxes. Former colleagues avoided eye contact or offered sympathetic nods while I gathered personal items. Jennifer, my assistant, had tears in her eyes as she helped me carry boxes to the elevator. The first indication that something had gone wrong came 3 weeks after my resignation. Morrison Tech's implementation team discovered that they couldn't proceed with Pentagon installations without licensing agreements for the core technologies. The encryption protocols, network architecture, and integration systems that made their proposal superior were all protected by patents filed in my name. Brian Walsh called me personally, his voice maintaining professional courtesy while barely concealing panic. He explained that there seemed to be some administrative confusion about technology ownership and suggested that we meet to clarify the situation. I agreed to lunch at a neutral restaurant in Midtown, curious to see how he'd approach the conversation. Walsh arrived with a lawyer and a briefcase full of documents that supposedly proved Morrison Tech's ownership of all project-related innovations. His argument was creative, but legally meaningless. Since I developed the technology while employed by Morrison Tech, intellectual property rights automatically belonged to the company. He offered a consulting agreement that would regularize the situation while providing me with ongoing compensation. I listened politely while reviewing his documentation, noting several critical errors in his legal reasoning. The patents I'd filed were based on innovations developed using personal resources and independent research conducted outside company time. My employment contract explicitly reserved rights to independently developed intellectual property, a clause I negotiated 8 years earlier with exactly this scenario in mind. More importantly, the Pentagon contract specifically required the winning bidder to own or control all underlying technologies. Since Morrison Tech couldn't demonstrate ownership or licensing rights, they were technically in breach of contract terms. The Department of Defense could cancel the entire agreement and rebid the project to qualified competitors. I explained this reality to Walsh with the same calm precision I'd used during Pentagon presentations. His lawyer took notes while Walsh's face gradually displayed the full implications of their situation. Morrison Tech had three options: negotiate licensing terms with me, forfeit the contract, and face massive legal penalties, or attempt to reverse engineer my innovations and risk patent infringement lawsuits. The licensing terms I proposed were straightforward: exclusive rights to use my technologies for the Pentagon contract in exchange for 70% of all contract revenues. Additionally, I would retain ownership of the intellectual property and the right to license it independently for future projects. The terms weren't negotiable. Walsh attempted several counteroffers over the following weeks, each involving lower percentages and shared ownership structures. I declined them all with professional courtesy, reminding him that time was becoming a critical factor. The Pentagon was expecting implementation to begin in February, and delays would trigger penalty clauses that could cost Morrison Tech millions in additional FEs. Richard Morrison finally called me directly in late January. His tone was carefully controlled, but I detected the desperation underlying his professional facade. He suggested that we find a mutually beneficial solution that would preserve relationships while ensuring project success. He invited me to dinner at an exclusive restaurant where we could discuss terms privately. The dinner was surreal. Morrison spent the first hour apologizing for the unfortunate circumstances that had led to my termination and expressing regret about miscommunications regarding my value to the organization. He described my firing as a mistake and hinted that executive positions might be available if I were interested in returning to rectify the situation. When we finally addressed the licensing situation, Morrison's approach was more sophisticated than Walsh's crude legal threats. He acknowledged my ownership of the core technologies while emphasizing the partnership opportunity that the Pentagon contract represented. He painted a vision of ongoing collaboration that would benefit both parties while advancing American interests. I appreciated his diplomatic approach, but had no interest in returning to an environment where my contributions would be minimized and my identity would be considered a liability. The termination had been brutal and public. There was no going back to pretending everything was professional when they'd made their prejudices explicit. The final terms were actually more generous than my initial offer. Morrison Tech would receive exclusive rights to my technologies for the Pentagon contract in exchange for 65% of revenues. I would retain intellectual property ownership and the right to license innovations independently. Additionally, Morrison Tech would publicly acknowledge my role in developing the winning solution and provide references for future opportunities. Morrison signed the agreement that night, using a pen that had belonged to his grandfather and founded the company 50 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. He was signing away majority control of the largest contract in company history to someone he considered unsuitable to represent American interests. The Pentagon implementation began on schedule in March. Morrison Tech's engineering team worked with my licensing specifications to deploy the network infrastructure across military installations worldwide. Progress reports confirmed that performance exceeded original requirements while maintaining cost projections. Meanwhile, I established an independent consulting firm specializing in advanced communications security. My first client was the British Ministry of Defense, which had been monitoring the Pentagon project and wanted similar capabilities for their military networks. The European Union followed with a contract for civilian infrastructure protection. Within 6 months, my licensing revenues from the Morrison Tech contract exceeded $2 million per month. International clients were paying premium rates for access to technologies that had proven themselves in the world's most demanding security environment. I was building a portfolio of intellectual property that would generate income for decades. Sitting in my new office overlooking Central Park, I often reflect on the journey that brought me here. The view from the 38th floor reminds me that success isn't just about climbing ladders. Sometimes it's about building your own building. The licensing revenues from Morrison Tech continue flowing in monthly, now totaling over $14 million annually. My independent consulting firm employs 12 specialists and maintains client relationships across 4 continents. The technologies I developed during those intense months have become industry standards for secure government communications. More importantly, I've learned that authenticity isn't a liability to be managed. It's a strategic advantage to be leveraged. The same qualities that made me unsuitable for representing Morrison Tech, attention to detail, emotional intelligence, innovative thinking, and genuine passion for the work, these are exactly what made my solutions superior to anything our competitors could imagine. I still encounter subtle discrimination in new business environments, but my perspective has fundamentally changed. Instead of seeing prejudice as an obstacle to overcome, I recognize it as information about people and organizations I probably don't want to work with anyway. My success has given me the luxury of choosing clients who value excellence over comfort. Marcus and I moved to a larger apartment in the Upper West Side last spring. He's proud of what I've accomplished, but more importantly, he's proud of who I've become. I no longer moderate my voice during important calls or rehearse gestures in office mirrors. The energy I used to spend on performance is now focused on innovation and growth. Last month, I received a call from Sarah Chen, who'd been promoted to CEO after Richard Morrison's early retirement. She offered me the position of Chief Technology Officer with equity participation and complete autonomy over technical strategy. She also apologized for not speaking up more forcefully when I was terminated, acknowledging that the company had made a serious error in judgment. The offer was generous and the opportunity was meaningful, but I politely declined. I'd learned something valuable about power during those difficult months. The most effective form of influence isn't being indispensable to someone else's organization. It's making their organization dependent on what you uniquely provide. Morrison Tech needs my technologies to maintain their Pentagon contract, but I don't need Morrison Tech for anything. If this story resonated with you, remember that your authenticity is your greatest competitive advantage. Subscribe for more stories about people who turned prejudice into power and discrimination into opportunity. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being different isn't a weakness. It's often the source of innovation that changes entire industries. And if you have your own story of overcoming professional discrimination, leave it in the comments. Your voice matters, and your experience might inspire someone else who's facing similar challenges right now.